In this presentation, we shall discuss how we understand violence, addressing 4 core issues: the structures of violence, the effects of violence, the subjects of violence, and violence and intersectionality. This video has been produced by José Antonio Langarita, Núria Sadurní, and Pilar Albertín, researchers and lecturers at the University of Girona. Violence towards LGBTI+ children and young people has both symbolic and structural roots. This means that it is generated by a form of social organization such as work, the family, love, and other kinds of relationships. This violence is based on a set of structures. On the one hand, a patriarchal structure. Patriarchy is a social system, an established power hierarchy that gives precedence to everything related to cisgender men, and to the male figure over all other social forms. This also means that everything masculine is at the center of social relations. Patriarchy does not only organize gender, but also many other social dimensions that we shall explore throughout this module. On the other hand, a heterosexual structure, as a model that entails a set of social relations among people, including sexual practices. This social structure also works as a power structure that makes heterosexuality the dominant and socially desirable sexual orientation. In this regard, the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu used the term symbolic violence to discuss different relations of dominance around gender inequalities. Symbolic violence is not always visible, but it still has strong effects on people. For instance, since being heterosexual is always considered better in Western societies, when a child or young person realizes that they are homosexual, they may think they're not worth as much as if they were heterosexual. Even though the child in the example is not being beaten for being homosexual, symbolic violence still bears a strong effect on their self-esteem. These forms of symbolic violence permeate all spheres of life, such as language, religion, education, art, idea systems, and so on. Therefore, symbolic violence generates mental models, social references, and assumed lifestyles. Accordingly, we can say that this is socially normalized and tolerated violence. Let's consider another example of symbolic violence. In Western contexts, it is common to refer to a young boy as gay, or other derogatory terms, if this boy performs roles traditionally associated with a female gender, such as playing with dolls. When this happens, there are 2 effects. 1, the boy is insulted, and 2, heterosexual structures of social organization are reinforced. The latter implies reinforcing and legitimizing a context of violence, not only towards one boy in particular, but also towards all people who do not fit into normative forms of adherence to gender and sexuality. One of the main mechanisms that uphold patriarchal and heterosexual structures is the male-female binary, along with the heterosexual-homosexual binary. Such categories are naturalized and presented as something determined by biology and genetics. They therefore become essentialized and fixed in a permanent and unalterable condition, and they're seen as a product of nature in which social structures do not play a role. These dichotomies also act as a key mechanism for patriarchy. By stating binary, one of the 2 items in the binary becomes more socially valuable, in this case male, and everything male-related, and heterosexuality. This means that anybody that slips out of manhood and heterosexuality is more vulnerable to violence. Moreover, when a person does not reproduce the gender dichotomy, in other words, when someone falls into any kind of middle ground, vulnerability to violence becomes even more heightened. And the same thing happens when a person does not adhere to heterosexuality. This is the reason why many voices, both in science and in activism, explain gender and sexuality as a continuum of characteristics. So we understand that male and female are not 2 opposite elements, but rather 2 parts of a continuum, and that every person at each moment is situated at a particular point on this continuum. Structural violence is a social construction. This means that it is a product located in a specific socio-historical context and that it is constantly made and remade. It is inscribed progressively in the habits, practices, and even in people's bodies and desires. For example, it is found in roles, beliefs, regulations, and ways of organizing life. Social institutions assume a relevant role in this social construction. Looking back through history, taking a historical perspective, we can see how sexuality has changed over time and across cultures. In the Western context, from the 17th century onwards, sexuality became a tool for power and hence for social regulation. As a tool for population regulation, it also became a political tool. And it is precisely at this time that sexual categories and sexual identities were created in the form that we know them today. Science plays a very relevant role in the construction of sexuality as an object for power. Also around the same period, science started describing, and hence constructing, differences between male and female in the reproductive organs, in hormones, and in many bodily parts. Furthermore, science started contributing to the definition of normality and abnormality in relation to the objects of desire, also helping to build the heterosexual norm. In this sense, science constructed sexual differences, which in turn works towards controlling such sexual differences. Throughout this period, there are what we call pedagogies of sexuality in place. These operate through different means, such as the mass media, therapies, education programs, or more recently, social networks. We call them pedagogies because in a way they teach models of sexuality and gender. They show us how to use sexual organs, where to use them, and with whom. And they explain the difference between public and private and even specific sexual techniques. Violence towards children and young people who do not adhere to sexual and gender norms includes a wide range of attitudes and behaviors. It has a visible and an invisible side. Just like icebergs, there are parts that are visible to everybody, and then there is a huge chunk underwater that is only noticeable to the trained eye. In the visible part of the iceberg, we can find a form of violence that is clearly applied to bodies. This is directly related to behavior patterns and mental models based on patriarchy and heterosexuality as a system. On the other hand, in the invisible part of the iceberg, there are those types of attitudes and behaviors related to smoothly regulating and orienting towards a framework of heterosexuality, often unconsciously. West and Zimmerman, 1987, defined this as doing gender, and Judith Butler talked about gender performativity, also in relation to this matter. In Butler's sense, we represent and act out gender according to the cultural pattern that we have in each context, including the historical moment. By dooming all deviations from the norm to be a target for violence, both the visible and the invisible side of the iceberg work by regulating bodies, behaviors, feelings, and even desires. Here's an example of how gender expression is regulated by an interpellation, a calling when these young men think that they could be perceived as gay men, they automatically change their behavior to adhere more closely to gender norms, in this case to the norms of masculinity. We can see then how the seemingly invisible side of the iceberg acts upon people's bodies. We will now watch the video. Children are socialized into certain parameters about sexuality and gender. Some of the features of this context are: 1. Heterosexuality is the governing structure, as well as the norm in sexual and affective relationships. 2. Sexual characteristics related to each gender are specific and unchangeable, and they fit both a physical and a symbolic dichotomy. 3. There are only two genders, male and female, which are stagnant, and there is no possibility of circulating in between them. Since children are socialized into these parameters, they assume such parameters are natural and unchangeable. Here, it is important that we talk about subjectivity. Subjectivity is a psychic and emotional dimension of the individual, always built in relation to other people and to the context. In this respect, children's subjectivity is also built around the parameters of gender and sexuality that we've just mentioned. We wish to point out here that violent social structures create violent psychological structures. Hence, if children live in a context of violence against LGBTI plus people, they end up assimilating this relationship of dominance and submission that occurs in their closed environment. An example of this is internalized homophobia, which is fear, hate, or disdain towards one's own homosexuality. It is important to bear in mind that the effects of violence on children and young people does not only affect LGBTI plus children, but rather all children and young people.